we go. Right, now I'll share my screen. Oops. Can you see my screen? Yes? No?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just going to actually present the presentation. There we go. So welcome everyone to our Camden Digital Site Notice show and tell today. Thank you very much for coming. Just going to do a little introduction, kind of why we're here, and then introduce the team, and then hand over to the different members of the team who are going to be presenting today. So first of all, this is the FutureGov team that we're working with. So we'll go around and we will introduce ourselves. So my name's Gemma. I'm the delivery manager on the project, so kind of like a project manager, just making sure everything's ticking along. Steph, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself, and then can you pass to someone else?
Most certainly. Morning all, I'm Steph Webb. I'm the place director at FutureGov, and I kind of sponsor this project and help connect the teams at Camden and FutureGov. And I'll pass to Karen.
Karen, are you with us?
Sorry,
she may have. No.
I'm having connection issues here. I cannot connect to the Wi-Fi. Hi, I'm Karen, interaction designer, and I'll be helping with the prototype and testing. And that's it. That's it on today.
Hello, I'm Sung. I'm working across user research and some of the impact data things.
And I'm Harriet. I'm the service designer. So looking at how the product will be embedded in a wider service.
Thomas?
Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Cohut. I'm a principal consultant at FutureGov, and I'm leading the delivery of the work. Liberty.
Hi, I'm Liberty. I'm the head of content design at FutureGov, and I'm going to be, as you can imagine, doing the content design on this piece of work.
Really?
Really, that's what I'll be doing.
Lizzie?
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a software developer at FutureGov, and yeah, I'll be helping to build the prototype.
Lovely, thank you everyone. So if anyone hasn't been to a show and tell before, sorry if you have, sorry, this is slightly teaching Granny to suck eggs, but what actually is a show and tell? So just generally we really like to work in the open and be really kind of open and transparent and to kind of showcase what we're doing. So we like to do that. Also, we'd like to get some feedback from all the participants, so we can take into account what you've said going forwards, and maybe include some things in our iterations. And also, it's an opportunity for you to ask any questions you might have of us. And I think it's Steph now.
It is. So I'm just going to give us a lightning bit of background on what we did in the previous phase. So we conducted user research with kind of those that were relatively experienced and aware of the planning system, but also those that have never touched the planning system before, to start thinking about what kinds of information might they like to know about a particular development. We designed and kind of prototyped different interfaces, different interactions, but also critically we started trying to get under the skin of some of the data that is available in Camden's Open Data Hub, that might be available from the GLA Planning London Datahub, and we did some user testing of the prototypes we built, where with some really fascinating results in terms of how people would like to, what information people would like to see, how they would like to see it. So next slide, please, Gemma. So where we ended up at the end of the prior phase was some kind of recommended next steps for Camden. So first and foremost, kind of build a working version. The prototype you saw was built in Figma, and part of the challenge is to kind of pull in data from Camden's Open Data Hub and or elsewhere to kind of bring the notice to life, but also to start working with other planning authorities to help them use and apply potentially the code that underpins the site notice. But also of interest was kind of building a set of standards for data that isn't yet currently standardized or available. A lot of the user research we conducted suggested that people are interested in certain types of information or insight into a development, but much of that data exists, but it's locked in PDFs in perhaps in non-standardized ways. So we recommended producing kind of some non-technical standards there, and also thinking about the emerging innovations in planning and how this product could link with them. So the reducing invalid planning applications and the back office planning system. How might we link to those? Next slide, please, Gemma. So at the start of this phase with Camden, we did a bit of well, obviously you wouldn't be surprised here. We did lots of workshops. We did some exercises thinking about what should be the impact within 10 weeks. This is a 10-week project, but we want to think about how the impact of this project can cascade into 6 months' time, when we would hope that an MVP is kind of live as a public beta, and perhaps in 12 months when the MVP has been iterated and expanded, and then in 3 years when there's a full kind of end-to-end digital site notice service. So we looked at those kind of impacts for a resident of Camden, for Camden as the council, and for the planning sector as a whole. Next slide, please, Gemma. So what we came out of, and these are the kind of some of the priority objectives for this project. In the short term, residents should be able to view a site notice on time, that it's an easy way to be consulted by the council, that critically the information is clearer, simpler, and easier to understand, and that local residents know what a site notice is and understand how to comment on the proposals. For Camden, they want to be able to demonstrate the value of open data. They've got a really good open data hub. How can that be improved, and how can we show other councils that it's important to make your planning data openly available, and associated with that kind of generate excitement about what can be done with that data. It's really great that we all want to kind of experiment together. We know that we need to try some things in this phase of the project in terms of building a working site notice, but equally we're probably quite clear that there isn't the right data perfectly available now. So how can we understand what data we might need to collect in the future? And then for the broader planning sector, again, elements around seeing the value in open data, and also understanding the journey that needs to be gone through to open up that data. There was some interesting discussion as well about the physical site notice stuck to a lamppost. How can the insights that we've gained from users on the digital notice translate to the design of the physical notice? So we'll definitely do a little bit around that. But again, how can we generate excitement around open data? So those are the kind of broad objectives that we're going to be coming back to and using to guide our kind of MVP development. And we'll check back on these in future show and tells. And next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm going to pass over to Lizzie and Harriet.
Hello. Sorry, I've had to turn my camera off. Someone started drilling into the wall behind my desk just now, so it was really great timing. I've just moved and I'm sitting on my stairs. So we sort of looked into the sort of data side in this sprint to try and understand what kind of data is already available to us in a nice API format. And obviously the starting point was Camden's Open Data Hub and their sort of API, which we found was, so they've got a lot of different data sets on there, including planning applications. And the API for planning applications had sort of the essential information like address and a description and sort of current stage in the application, which was a sort of a limited subset of the data that we were sort of interested in the first phase, looking at the prototype. So we had another look at the Planning London Datahub API, which is available from the GLA, as that sort of looked like it was going to contain more information. So they have a lot more data points, so things like land use, application type, the number of new homes and the percentage of affordable housing, all of that kind of stuff, which sounds great. We had some problems getting hold of it. So the API, which, so I think it's all quite new. So they mentioned the API on their website, but it was quite hard to find the documentation, and we had to get it emailed to us. And we found that actually for the pilot sites that we were interested in for Camden, the data just wasn't there. So there was something, I think there was like a technical problem with how they were collecting the data from Camden, and it's pending a patch to Northgate, which is the system that Camden planners use, to be able to like actually get hold of that data from the Planning London Datahub. Next slide, please, Gemma. Thank you. So we wanted to look a little bit more into sort of why it was that the Camden Datahub had sort of such limited data when we knew that those sort of extra fields were being collected in the planning portal, and that the GLA was able to collect them. So we did a little sort of mini discovery into what was going on with the data that came out of the planning portal and how it was ending up in the Open Data API and in the Planning London Datahub. And so this was roughly the sort of the flow of the data that we found. So coming out of the planning portal, it sort of gets dumped to an XML file that's hosted on a server called OneApp. And from there, there's some of that data gets automatically pulled into Northgate and into Trim, which is Camden's file system for sort of the supporting documents, pictures and assessments, like that kind of stuff. Not all of it gets pulled in automatically. Some of it fails validations and then has to get pulled through manually. So there's quite a big manual process as well. And alongside the two systems of Northgate and Trim, which store some of the data, there's also the personal records that are being kept by planners for some major developments, which Harriet's going to talk about in a minute. But yes, so this was sort of interesting to find out about, partly because obviously we were just sort of trying to understand what was happening to the data, but then also just from the perspective of, for Camden, they're part of London, so they obviously will be able to get access to the Planning London Datahub, but for other authorities that are outside of London, who are still using the planning portal, who will be able to get hold of that XML file. It was interesting to know that that is available, so that data's there, and it would be possible to sort of pull that out and do something similar to what Planning London Datahub is doing to get access to that data. I think I'm going to hand over to Harriet now to talk about personal records a little bit more.
Thanks, Lizzie. So as well as kind of understanding what the work that's going on with the systems to take the data from the planning portal and get it into a format where it can be shared, it was also really important for us to understand the people work that's happening. So what is the kind of admin or the work that planners are undertaking to get data into a better format for sharing? And we found out some quite interesting things. So in theory, the data should be pulled from the planning portal into the XML file and from the XML file into M3, Northgate and Trim. But what actually happens is that often that data is not pulled through automatically. Some issues with the files, for example, sometimes the descriptions might be too long, but also because of the major development application and the complexity of those applications, sometimes it's not pulled through correctly. So it turns out that often planners are even then contacting developers and asking for developers to email over their applications so that they can manually enter data into Northgate and Trim. And even when stuff is pulled through automatically, planners are doing a lot of work to rewrite and reorganize some of that data in M3, Northgate and Trim. But then they're also keeping personal records, and these are sort of like notes. So I'm just going to move us on to the next slide, please, Gemma. So these are some screenshot examples of the kinds of things that planners might keep. And this is because the data is not pulled through automatically or in a usable format. They're keeping their own records to clean and organize data in a way that's better than existing systems like M3. And also on here, they might be gathering more complex data points, such as population density calculations. So the next sort of stage of this discovery will be digging into this a little bit more, because this is likely to be a key opportunity for the site notice. Because if planners are already putting work in to transform data or process data so that it can be shared, then there's an opportunity for this for the back end of the site notice to be something that planners use to do this. So we're going to be looking into that a little bit more. So we'd like to do a quick exercise with everybody. So if you could go over to menti.com, and then you need to enter this code. And there are a few questions in there about this step.
Has everyone managed to get in to Menti?
Yep, all good.
Good. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing because I'm going to share the results.
Is it just a question, Gemma, or
There
are
should
we?
be 3 questions. So when you submit the first one.
Mine got stuck after the first one.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Same here. Only asked me one question.
Okay, no problem.
Wondering if you can clarify, like to you, what is somewhat, what is a lot, what's all the time, so that maybe.
I think a lot for me is a day.
Yeah. So like maybe somewhat is like a few hours, a lot is a day, and then all the time is like days more than a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
I'm slightly, Menti's being a bit straight. Oh, now someone has voted. Does the next question appear for people?
You did now for me.
It has no, yeah.
I've worked it out.
Awesome.
So if you go back onto it now, you should be able to do the next question. Good, good. Cool. And then I think if I go through to the last question, you should get another question where you can enter some text.
Yeah, got it.
Yes. Woo! Brilliant. Okay, lots of stuff going into there, which is excellent. Harriet, do we want to go through the results?
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Give me a second. Here we go.
Interesting. This is good. It's well, it supports our working assumption that we've uncovered. Does anybody want to comment on this? Any of the planners in the room? No? Okay.
I'll comment on that. It takes forever to register a major development because the planning portal only has a 5 megabyte file size, which is a pain. So I set up a OneDrive of developers so they can essentially a Dropbox so they can give me all the files, and then I have to manually load them myself. So it's probably a good few days work to register a major development, I'd say.
For people that have either worked at other councils before, or I don't know how familiar you are with workings of other councils, do you think this graph would be fairly typical, what we would see across the country or in different councils? Or is that something we need to do a bit more digging in to find out?
I think that's yeah, that's going to be a common result. I've when I worked at another authority doing major developments, it was the same thing. I would keep separate notes and I would draw out the information. Yeah, so I think it's quite a common approach.
Somebody put not at all. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's me. Ignore that one because I'm not a planner. So
okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it doesn't really apply. So that's why I put not at all.
Sure.
Right.
And the somewhat? Okay, should we move on to the next slide, Gemma?
Yeah. I don't know why it doesn't just, there is no way to go next on here. Silly Menti, right, we'll present again.
Interesting. Is the no, are you the same person who put not at all from before?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's me again.
Sure. The next question then, please, Gemma.
Yeah.
This might look a bit messy because it's, and we can.
Wow.
Oh, great.
Great. This
Quite
is
neat.
amazing. Clarity. Can someone explain clarity? That's the biggest word here, and I want to know what people mean by clarity.
I put clarity on it, that the first word, and I think it basically, when I get the planning application, especially a major one, I just need to get clear in my head what is the proposal for and what are the drawings trying to represent. So is that kind of process getting to my head around what actually needs to be achieved here.
Yeah, I put the same, exactly the same reasons. Really, it's just about it's about getting the headline point, so it allows you to sort of like step back and see and understand on a more basic level what you're looking at in terms of the impacts of the development. I know that was also the first word I put in as well.
Does anybody else want to comment on their answer?
I quite like. I think one of the things as well that I put in was around, which I think is related to a couple of them on here. I would sort of like group them together. Was the one which says faster to access and then one source. I think it was that. And convenience. It's that thing of like getting it all in one place, because you have, for a major development, there can just be so many documents, and this information is spread across so many different sort of sources of information, much of which isn't data. So it makes it so much easier to put it in one location, provide that clarity of, okay, here it is as a bit of data all in one place. It's absolutely crucial, because otherwise you'd just be wading through huge numbers of documents every time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, everybody. That was really interesting. So now I think we're moving on to talk about research.
We are. We will be. Oops.
Actually, just one thing to mention here, it might be in next steps as well, but it's that we've got some sessions in with Jono, Nora and Kate, I think, to look at your process for this, so what it is that you're doing in the background with data to make it clearer, to make it more usable. But we'd like to test this with other councils. So yeah, if people can help us get in touch with some other planners, that'd be really helpful. So research approach, what have we been up to? So moving into the beta phase, and knowing that kind of the minimum viable thing to do here is to produce the site notice with data that people can use. Our kind of central question was, what information do people need to make informed judgments about whether a development is good or bad? So the site notice, I suppose, serving two purposes really. It's out there as a piece of information about a development so that residents can make a judgment, and then it's out there so that residents can give an opinion on that judgment or influence that decision if they want to. We sort of split this into three main chunks. The first was just around people's relationship to the neighbourhood and how they feel about the local area and kind of what their attitudes might be towards influencing decisions around that, or whether they've ever done that before. So here we had an open-ended discussion with them with some probing questions around their prior engagement with planning and thoughts on their local area. We also wanted to test whether the sort of, if we provide information in X way, as in a digital site notice format, is that something that they think would increase engagement? So here, Karen is going to show us the wonderful prototypes that we've got now, but we use those to prompt discussion around, like, what does this change your view of planning or your local area? And then finally, we did some work around understanding how people respond to planning content. So we did a card sorting exercise here, and what we did was we took lots of the data points out of the major development applications. So things like land use, development type. So we presented it to them in the kind of jargon as it's presented in an application. And we asked them to tell us if they knew what those words meant, or what those kind of concepts meant. And then we asked them to sort those different pieces of information by whether they were essential, nice to have, or whether they just didn't care about those. So now we're going to talk through what we found from that. Oh, no, we're not. We're going to tell you who we researched with. We made a real concerted effort this time around to reach people who don't usually engage in planning decisions. So with a particular focus on low income residents. So we were looking at low income in terms of whether people live in social housing, are in receipt of benefits, or have a family household income of less than £20,000. The majority of people had been in Camden for a very long time. I think bar one person, everybody had lived in Camden for more than 10 years. More than half were Camden born and bred. And yeah, we had a mix of people living in social housing or just council tenants in the private rented sector, and a couple of homeowners.
Hello again, everyone. So now I'm going to very quickly talk about the prototype and the thinking behind it. So first of all, we wanted to learn and to test our riskiest assumptions. So the discussion was which criteria we would use to kind of select the sites we would test. So we decided to go with major developments and that are geographically near to where the residents live. The assumptions with that were that one is they're more likely to be familiar with this development. So they're walking around the block, taking their kids to school, and they see something happening there. They're more likely to feel directly affected by them. So Obviously, if it's near them, they can feel more of the impacts of potential noise or potential disturbance and traffic. And as a result of these first two, they would be more likely to engage and provide feedback. So again, obviously, to the point that they feel the impacts of this development, how they can affect them, they would be more likely to engage and to kind of try to get their voice heard. Next screen, please, Gemma. So here we are showing the kind of first prototype we're testing. So this prototype is what we're calling here minimum data prototype. So this is minimum data, meaning that we only use the data that we could get from the Camden Open Data API. And as Lizzie said, there were some gaps in this data. So we consciously tested this prototype to understand how people and how much people could understand from it. So some of the main aspects here, we wanted to understand this first engagement. So would citizens and residents want to engage with the planning via this app, like with the app format and the mobile format? And also, if I think even most importantly, if people that don't currently engage, if they would be more likely to engage if they had something easy on the hands. Second aspect is data. So how much can understand from this minimum available data displayed? So would this be enough to show them something relevant that they would want to have an opinion on and to engage with? And then the content. So what aspects of the planning process and types of information are they more interested in? And then terminology. So how do residents respond to planning terminology? And these two aspects we tested a bit further with the content card sorting exercise. It's I think is going to talk to you a bit more about later. And yeah, on the right, you can see the prototype that we tested. I think that's it for me. I think hand it over to Harry. Is that it? Sunk?
Oh, so yes, I will talk us through some of the research insights. So the good news, the positive news is there was overwhelming universal support for the tool. Everyone thought it was a really great idea. It's about time. Digitalization will kind of make site notices easier to access and easier to understand. I have a direct quote here from Zelda. The app is a really positive thing. It's nice that Camden as a borough is trying to make information more accessible to us. It shows that they care. I'm just cracking up with the comments in the chat. It's probably why she's crying. She's so moved by how much Camden cares to kind of invest in this tool. But on another more serious note, residents also noted that digitalization alone probably isn't going to kind of solely do the trick. It needs to be paired with things like feedback loops and raising awareness as well, if we really want to raise the level and the quality of engagement and the diversity of engagement across the board. Kind of in the next slide, a little bit more detail into that and some of the mental models that people kind of approach engagement with planning in. So I think the first thing to say is that generally residents, especially people who had lived in Camden, this was actually a bit surprising for me, but people who had lived in Camden, especially throughout their life and seen a lot of change, were actually really positive about the impact that recent developments have brought to Camden. It's brought about prosperity, brought about safety, new job opportunities. It's seen as something really necessary to address the housing crisis that's faced in the borough and the city and the country at large. At the same time, people noted some of the downsides of development, things like inequality, gentrification, and more personal impacts, things like loss of light to their homes, noise, disruption of building works, loss of community space or green spaces, which are not reasons to oppose development, but are things that people want to mitigate during the development process. When it comes to why people don't engage more with planning, we found that trust and awareness were some of the primary barriers. So trust, not necessarily trust in the council, but trust in the planning process. Many people think developments are inevitable, often driven by money. And as little people, either they don't have influence or they don't know that their opinions can matter or how to give feedback or how their voice can be valuable. So those are kind of question marks about the feedback process and their awareness. But I think the thing to stress is that people are actually kind of interested and they do want to have that engagement. They're particularly interested in hyperlocal influence and hyperlocal impacts. So people want to know about developments that are in their immediate surroundings that will have an immediate impact on them. And these are the developments they feel they are most likely to want to give feedback in and feel like they can and should. And they also want room for more constructive feedback. People mentioned that today they view planning, or people view planning, as mainly a negative thing. It's something that you only think to engage in when you oppose a development, because what's the point of just saying a support if you think it's inevitable anyways? People mention, for instance, wanting to have more of a say in co-creating what the green space or what the playground might look like. And there isn't really a venue or a format for doing that today that people know. And I think the last kind of topic here is language. We didn't find language to be the primary barrier that people stated to be the reason why they don't engage with planning, but we did find that people were confused, particularly by some of the jargon describing the application and development types and stages, which did prevent people from understanding information correctly in some instances. So going to the next slide, more about content design. So what information resonated people? What do they want? And I think it's a bit, it kind of reminds me of what I think was Rich and Nora, you mentioned earlier, this idea of like clarity. I think people really wanted to know, people had questions that they wanted to know. So how does this affect me? What is it going to look like? What's the story here? How can I influence this? What do others think? And I think there's something interesting in content design here about, rather than kind of presenting a lot of facts and numbers and figures for people to figure out themselves, how do we pull out some of this information a little bit more clearly so that people can respond to it? I think there are some bits here that were interesting. For instance, what does it look like? People appreciated massings that make real what the volume and the size and the shape of development is, and also thought that massings were fairly objective compared to some of the renderings that contain marketing content, and people didn't really like that, but they appreciated the help kind of being able to visualize it in space. People, for a lot of the technical information, especially around things like environmental standards or sewage or kind of utilities, people didn't want all of that technical information. And partially that's a good thing because they really trust the council to ensure standards. And so kind of going to the next slide, the last bit here is that people really wanted to know others' opinion and feedback. And I think there's an interesting level of like community, designing for community here, right? People really are curious to see what others think. And some have said that they might be more interested to weigh in if they knew a development was controversial, or if they knew that their opinion sort of like mattered in a broader dialogue. So that was kind of interesting. Lastly to conclude, so we started with a list of, I think, 45 content cards, and working with the residents, we prioritized it into these kind of big buckets. So the darker gray are ones that people ranked more highly, and the lighter grades are more kind of optional, secondary importance. So there's kind of the info on the development, the name, address, description, land use, image of massings, height, and the development type, and then the application info, which includes things like type, date for work to start, construction timing, deadline for comments. And then people also prioritized wanting to know the impact on local spaces, things like number of new homes, amount of garden, open space, how access and parking will be impacted, as well as the impact on local services like healthcare, school, jobs, and transport. And lastly, impact on community and the community infrastructure levy. What we also discovered kind of a few kind of features or general content pages that might be useful to kind of give an overview. So things like allowing people to search by proximity to their home, having a page or having information telling people why and how their feedback matters, and kind of making it clear that, you know, feedback is important and how. Having a page that talks about how Camden ensures environment and safety standards across all of the development, so that people don't have to go into the nitty-gritty details, but are feeling like it is taken care of, and being able to have an explanation of some of the impact data calculations here, like the healthcare demand or the new jobs. So that was kind of it on research insights. Any questions, I guess, before going to the next steps?
Can I just ask that I thought like the prioritization of them and stuff was sort of I suppose it's not that surprising for most of it, but I think there are some that sort of surprised me a little bit from some of the discussions that we'd had in the first phase of this project. And I wonder if, like, do you think, like, how much do you think that would change if the demographic of those people we asked changed, of that stuff? Like, how much do you think? Because I just noticed that before, I think younger people were more concerned around things like CO2, like air quality and things like that, and also transport impact, which I was quite surprised at actually. But I don't know. I don't know how much you think the sort of the demographic group that you test has an influence over how they will prioritize those things.
Yeah, this probably won't answer your question exactly, but I've just got a couple more kind of like observations, I think, based on what you said. Like, so transport, something that I found really interesting was that a lot of the people who've lived in London for their whole lives, the fact that transport's busy is kind of a given of living in the city. So things like busyness and like new people in the area, those are like things that they're almost proud of, because that's what makes London London. So they're like, you know, I'm not one of these people that's going to complain about like busy transport, like that's just how it is. It almost like didn't feature in their concerns, but things like new homes, because of the impact on inequality, were like really important. So that was my observation on transport, but it did surprise me too.
I think maybe more, I think it's not that people didn't care about the environment and transport. Those are two things people did care about. I think one of the key insights we found is that people want to know very practically how something will impact them or their community. So I think a number like CO2 emissions, it's just an abstract number. Like even young people who, even myself, I care about climate. It's an abstract number. It's
yeah,
visualized,
totally.
And you can't really give feedback on it. And that's kind of why, kind of instead of like giving feedback or knowing the number, people would much rather, well, we kind of wanted to suggest more of a general page where Camden talks about how climate and environmental standards are featured across its development, and how
Right.
or maybe a story about how this development is innovating on climate, or rather than like number of heat pumps or like CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
I think the same thing with transport. Things that are more kind of physical and easy to understand are things like, is there parking? Is there roads? Like that's something that people can imagine. I think particularly because Camden is such a busy cosmopolitan area anyways. And like, it's like, we're really talking around the King's Cross area, you know, like especially, but even around Highgate, like these are such kind of busy metropolitan places with really busy tube lines anyways. And I think the feeling is like one new development versus like office buildings. I think it's a bit too abstract for people to kind of imagine it mattering, and imagining the calculations making like, it's harder for people to imagine what these numbers mean to them, if that makes sense, rather than things like vehicle parking. I think it's just really immediate. So I think there's something interesting. I don't know if it's necessarily about the demographic, but I think there's something psychologically interesting about what figures people want to have a say on because it matters to them personally, versus what they'll take Camden's word as good, what they just want to be handled and not really want to weigh in.
Can I just jump in a bit on that? Because I think like it's quite similar with the floor areas generally, as we saw some of the user testing were raising the issue that I don't know what that means. Like, what does it mean 2 hectares or 300 square meters? And maybe this is something that we can look at to kind of formalize it in a way that is relevant to people, like to football pitches, like we gave an example and someone was like, oh yeah, now I understand it, but maybe we can refer to that in terms of CO2 emissions and air quality with that measurement, like how much impact do cars have on air quality, or from 2 to 20 or 200. So maybe there is scope to address it in that way, kind of make it clear. All about clarity.
Yeah, maybe I don't know if Liberty's on the call want to talk a bit about content design, but I think it does give a really interesting brief to content design, because it's not just about, I think when we first came into this exercise, it was very much about how do we make jargon more simple, or how do we simplify jargon and make it less confusing? And we did find that to be true for some of the bits of content like massings or like development type and application type. But I think for everything else, people understand what bike parking means, but I think there might still be some interesting content design challenges about like how do we make it feel relevant to people. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
So
I was just gonna echo what Zong said. There's nothing really for me to add.
sorry, I'm struggling to put my hand up on this. I can't find that icon. I'm George, by the way, and I do strategic frameworks. And just I just wanted to comment on the demographics, what Richard was saying earlier, and what you mentioned about transport and about CO2 emissions, is that they come through extremely strongly in our consultations. People really want to know about the impact more people will have on transport facilities in the area, and also on air quality as well. So I do think maybe the demographics at this stage might influence these prioritized content that we have here. So maybe if we maybe, I don't know, look at people looking maybe further out from central Camden, we'd find that they might be more interested in those two areas like transport and CO2 emissions.
I think that's a really good point, George. And I guess this comes down to the point of the fact that this is what happens when we target people who don't normally get engaged in planning, right? Because so like our view is, well, what do we hear all the time from all the people who are normally engaged in planning? And we hear that what they're worried about is whether or not they're going to get stuck in a traffic jam, like, in their car. Whereas actually, if you speak to groups of people who, like Harriet was saying, are like much more accepting of the fact that, well, London's busy and it's, and actually it's more about, okay, like they might worry more about if there's an impact on infrastructure, but they don't maybe think about it from the perspective of like, oh, well, it's going to be busier. Then, they're probably more likely to use public transport and everything, aren't they? So, yeah, I think that's it. It's a good point, but I guess this shows the importance of like talking to people who we don't normally engage.
Yeah, I think we would agree that maybe the demographic split that's creating this is the fact that we talk to people, like Rich, you said, who don't regularly engage. Because I'm sure some people will care much more about kind of climate and road impact. The one thing I want to say is people did, like, this is the list of things that were prioritized, and CO2 emissions and tubes are on here, right? It wasn't the things that people really didn't care about was like, where does the foul sewage go? That doesn't even feature on here. So, and I still think that we're making the case that it should be included in the app, maybe just not as the first thing, and maybe we need to do a bit of storytelling to make it clear, especially on the CO2 emissions. What does that mean and why people should care?
Sounds good.
Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming next. So we've got another 2 sprints left of the project, which is 4 weeks. And in that time, as you remember from Steph's slide at the beginning, we need to have gotten to a point where we've got a working site notice, but also we need to be thinking about how the work that we've been doing in Camden could be replicated by other councils, and to find out if it's achievable, if it's feasible, understand a bit more about what the implementation will need to look like. But the first bit of kind of next steps is going to be about designing, building, testing and iterating the site notice. So the version that that Karen showed earlier, now we know a little bit more about the feasibility of data. We've had all this great insight that Sonia and Harriet have been through. We can do iterations on those interaction designs and create the next version of the site notice, incorporating new content as well that Liberty will be working on. We're going to do a bit of testing of that as well, not in as much depth as the research we've done so far, but we're going to find opportunities to test this updated version of the site notice with residents in Camden, focusing again on people who don't normally engage. We're going to then do a bit of service design that puts our product within an end-to-end service where people are able to give feedback, and also addresses the fact that there might be barriers to their engagement. With this kind of end-to-end service, at this stage, we probably won't have designed all the bits in a kind of functional way, in that we may not have the right kind of landing page on the website yet, or there might not be a full like Rolls-Royce feedback loop design, but there will be something that enables feedback as a part of this iteration. And then, as Harriet was saying earlier, we're going to spend a bit of time with some planners to know more about what happens in their kind of admin world and in the back end, so that we can make sure that if we are creating some kind of feedback loop, even if that's just thumbs up, thumbs down, there are people in the planning team able to respond to that and use it in an effective way. And then next slide, Gemma. And then, as I say, we need to have a bit of a think about what implementation looks like in Camden, but also to be able to share this with other councils. So you need to know if councils have similar capabilities to Camden, an appetite. Also, if people who live in, I don't know, rural Lincolnshire have similar attitudes to kind of planning data. It may not be the same depending on where they are. And yeah, that's what we're up to. So will be another show and tell, I think, before the end of the project. So do join for that one as well. And as Harriet said, we're interested in kind of testing this and learning more about other councils and what they do. We have quite a few contacts ourselves, but if there are people you know in other councils who you think would be really up for engaging with this work and testing the prototype, do let us know. Any questions? No worries if not. I would hold you to questions.
I was just going to ask a question about the data side of it. So obviously there was this, there are sort of problems with how the data sort of like split out and stuff. But I guess the advantage of sort of having a lot of the data in from the one app server, like you've kind of pointed out earlier in it. With that, do you think that ultimately there will be something that you would want to sort of scale from there, or do you think it's something that you want to sort of create as a blend? Because you obviously talked about the fact that people keep their own notes and they do a lot of data sort of reorganization and cleaning and so on. So I suppose there's an opportunity to sort of like merge them in some way and use the data from there. And then, so the question was, firstly, do you think that that's likely to be sort of the way it goes, that it uses some kind of mixture of those bits of data? And then secondly, what do you think is sort of, because one of the outputs of this project, obviously we're looking at, is effectively the data standards, like i.e. what data do we want? Do we want to have a sort of consistent approach, and then we'll know how we want the data presented to be able to get the notice to work. What do you think is the best way of sort of then enforcing that in future? Because I know, I suppose one of the obvious ones for us is that what we can do is we can ask applicants through our local application requirements to submit the data in that format already. As part of it, so once we understand how people sort of process the data, and then maybe how they could process it a little bit differently or a little bit better for sort of end users, for citizens who are looking at these notices, there's an opportunity potentially to try and to have that set of information there to be able to say to councils, well, you can just adopt this as your local application requirements, and then you could have something similar. Have you thought about any other ways that might scale? I know we're sort of like jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm just sort of thinking about that. Yeah, like the potential to scale onto a next phase, if you like.
Yeah, Gemma, do you mind going back to slide 27 so that we can kind of look at all the content?
Which one's slide 27? Sorry, Zong.
The one with all the prioritized content.
This one?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if Lizzie and Steph, you have anything to add, but that was, I think from my end, that was going to be my next step, was actually to set up a meeting with Rich, yourself, and Steph and a few others next week to kind of look at, I think the answer is we probably haven't thought as far as to have the final conclusion for it yet. I think we wanted to do a bit more. Now that we have the prioritized content, I think our next step is we wanted to look at what can we pull from the system today, and does it make sense, and is it similar to how other councils are presenting it, and is it something that in the second round of testing, do users understand this figure? And with, I think especially with the impact data, things like yeah, I think there are two big things here for me. So one is the impact data, things like local healthcare demand, local school demand, new jobs, CO2 emissions. We wanted to do a bit of digging on like, how are these things calculated, and is that standard across everyone in the Camden team, and is that standard with how maybe other councils calculate it? So those are some of our next steps before we can kind of come at a data standard. I think something else that's also interesting that we need to think about is the image of massings. It's something that people really said they want, and the next step for us is to figure out what, are there any standards there that we can create from both a technical perspective, but also from a usability perspective for people to understand. So probably, I don't know, Steph, if you have anything to add here, but I think.
Yeah, so I'd agree with all of that. I think in terms of what needs to be in our mind in terms of scaling, we need to test a few things. So as Zung said, there's some of this will work already, but there is data stroke information, but is it of sufficient quality, not necessarily to be pulled into the app, but so that people understand it? And clearly our insights around the work that planners have to do to hack this and improve the quality of this information, the process is quite not interesting. So actually the route to scaling might be creating a consistent, I've previously called it a content environment, which is the rubbish term, but somewhere where the data from Planning Portal or M3 or the Planning London Datahub can be consistently pulled through, automatically pulled through, added to, improved from a content perspective, and then published into a notice. That might be the route to scaling. We haven't explored that quite enough yet in terms of how we start building the things. And the other thing to be conscious of in scaling is clearly things like the Planning London Datahub aren't nationwide. I know that people at like Greater Manchester are looking at similar things, but we do need to think about, well, actually, could a future standard be something that's in the Planning London Datahub? Because therefore the schema exists with the Planning Portal, it'll be easy to scale that. So there's a lot of considerations, and I think the final type almost of opportunities for scaling via standards is the really knotty stuff that I'd like to, I think, focus on more. So we talked a bit about carbon CO2 emissions, but actually standards that require context, as it were. Who knows or can properly understand whether the CO2 emissions from one building is much higher or lower than another. So actually the standard might be about comparative emissions. This building has 10% higher carbon dioxide emissions than one like it around the corner, kind of thing. So I think that there's a lot that can be done with standards. I think we'll learn over the next sprint what data can be pulled into the site notice now, and what might that mean for where we need to concentrate standard efforts around standardization to support scaling.
Cool. Any more questions from anyone else?
I didn't have a question, but I just sort of had a comment, and it was just around the other general content in there. And I just think maybe this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but is it maybe good to sort of think about how we can maybe support our communities to make comments that can be considered, considered in their either objection or support of the planning application, i.e. valid material considerations. I just think, making these comments isn't easy for everybody. And I know we have divided some of these areas into impacts on that prototype that we had. And I know we don't want to coerce people, to say particular things, but maybe we could start dividing. We could provide some advice on how to make a comment in relation to each of those impacts, a comment that would be considered, or maybe put it into another category in the general content of that page you showed us for the prioritized content. But just something to start thinking about. I don't know what you thought of that.
I can take that one. Yes, I'm really pleased that you brought that up, George, because we agree that the kind of main purpose or driver for doing digital site notices is to increase resident engagement in planning decisions. So we know that it's one thing to provide the information, it's a whole other thing to gather good feedback and help people to do that. And I think in the alpha, that was the main thing we learned. It's that it's partly about making the information accessible. It's partly about kind of structuring the content in a way that makes people feel confident that their opinion is going to be valuable and heard. And like it was reiterated again this time that like the major barriers to people like giving their opinion is that for lots of people, they just don't even know they're allowed to have an opinion on it. So it's never really occurred to them that like the building down the road is something that they might actually be able to influence. So yeah, for the kind of first iteration or the kind of minimum viable kind of version that we'll be doing for this project, we will have something quite basic, as Thomas had said. So we're not going to have the Rolls Royce of feedback loops because we need to get the site notice, like the kind of basic thing done. But over time, the next phase will definitely recommend that is explored much further. But the other thing that's really crucial here is understanding Camden, from Camden's point of view, what happens when they receive, say they put the site out, say you put the site notice out in the world and you receive 56 comments. What do you do with that? And it's really important that we get that bit right and ensure that people's input can be made sense of and can be put like towards some decision making in order to build trust, because that's what people are worried about. They think even if they give their opinion, it doesn't matter and it's not going to be used, so what's the point? So we're really keen that what we get out, we spend enough time thinking about the back end of this, so that feedback matters before we kind of go and design something beautiful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Good to hear.
One additional point on that, we've just done a piece of work in Tallinn, which was looking at trying to encourage better kind of feedback loops between residents and people who work in planning, called architects in Tallinn, but that's not a debate to get into right now. But it was really interesting that there was quite a fear within the Tallinn planning team about what it would mean to receive all this feedback if they were going to start opening up different bits of development for more kind of consultation and engagement. But really kind of purposefully defining what constitutes meaningful and useful feedback and designing an interface which encourages that kind of useful feedback. You're not encouraging whether people like it or don't, or if they have one view or another, but you're creating an interface that means that the feedback is useful and that it comes at the right stage in the planning process. So people aren't, complaining, it's the wrong word, people aren't commenting on the colour of doors or something. They're actually giving the right kind of information, the right kind of feedback at the right point, so planners are able to use it. So yeah, that's a big priority for us as we move forward.
Right.
Great. Well, if anyone does have any more questions, feel free to pop any of us an email or a message, and we'll let you know any details of the next show and tell. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your days. We've finished a bit early, so go and have a coffee or something. Bye.
Right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.